you are sitting on the wooden floor of a backstage chamber, where the scent of old incense clings to the walls like memory. A single paper lantern flickers at your side, its orange light casting shadows across the grain of the timber. Your shoulders are bare. Your kimono has slipped, not by accident. You do not pull it up. You have been taught not to. The man before you kneels in silence. His hair is tied back with precision, his robes pristine and dark, like a magistrate or a priest. But he is neither. His hand is heavy on your neck, not to strike but to claim. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. You've heard enough from the others. The older boys. The ones who already stopped crying. The floor beneath you is cold, but you dare not shift. Beside you lie two painted masks. One smiles, one weeps. Both are lifeless, but more familiar than your own face now. You were once praised for your beauty, the shape of your eyes, the elegance of your wrists. And that was when everything began to change. Before we continue, if you value dark and forgotten history, consider subscribing. Tell us where you are watching from. It truly helps us create more stories like this. Now, back to the video. In the candlelit shadows of Edo, Japan, behind the silk stage curtains and the thunderous applause of the Kabuki theater, a darker ritual unfolded, one never recorded in the official scripts. Young boys, some as young as 13, were chosen not just for their skill in performance, but for their beauty. Their slim bodies and delicate features made them ideal for the roles of onagata male actors who performed as women on stage. But these roles did not end when the curtain fell. In specialized tea houses known as yukaku or kagami-ro, the line between art and servitude dissolved completely. These boys were offered not always with consent to wealthy patrons, merchants, nobles, and most notably, samurai. What began as theater became transaction, and what was called tradition often hid exploitation. They were performers by day and possessions by night. Each night, the boy would strip off his embroidered costume, only to assume another one invisible, but no less binding. The makeup removed from his face in front of the cracked mirror would be replaced by a blank expression learned through repetition and survival. Every line delivered on stage became a rehearsal for silence later. The lanterns would flicker, the samurai would arrive, and the boy would kneel, as taught. There was no contract, there was no protest, there was only the system. Kabuki itself was born in subversion, a world where men played women, and performance blurred with pleasure. But what began as defiance became discipline. The onagata were trained to move with grace, to speak with softness, to embody a femininity that was designed not for empowerment, but for consumption. And the consumption was never just visual. You see, the samurai class in Edo, Japan, lived within a code Bushido that was said to honor loyalty, restraint, and virtue. But in truth, behind closed paper screens and sliding doors, many followed another custom altogether, wakashudo, the so-called way of the youth. This was not merely a mentorship. It was not the romanticized bond of equals. It was a practice where older men took adolescent boys as companions, emotional, social, and often sexual. When paired with kabuki, it became institutionalized. The samurai did not need to seek their companions in battlefields or schools. They found them in the theater, and in the tea houses beside them. It is easy now to frame this in shadows, to imagine a singular villain, a handful of victims. But it was not like that. It was organized, expected, even celebrated. Actors were trained not just in gesture and dance, but in etiquette, in deference, in how to forsake just slow enough for a man to touch their wrist. And if they were successful, they were praised, rewarded, protected, but never freed. To become desirable was a blessing, but to remain so was a prison. The boy in the thumbnail is one among many. You saw his eyes. He is not surprised, only tired, because this is not his first time kneeling, and it will not be his last. He does not hate the samurai, not aloud, not even inwardly. He has been taught that hate is improper, that stillness is beauty, that survival is silence, and so he endures. And you, centuries later, are only now hearing his story not from official records, which praise the elegance of the onagata, nor from the writings of their patrons, who called them companions, not victims, but from what was left unsaid, from the paintings where eyes do not meet, from the diaries hidden in theater walls, from the empty stage long after the performance ended. From the soft pressure of a hand on a boy's throat, not in anger, but in ownership. This was not theater. It was a system, and the curtain never closed. To understand the system that entrapped the boy in the thumbnail, you must first understand the world that applauded him. Edo, Japan, from the early 1600 seconds to the mid-negative 1800 seconds, was a realm of meticulous structure. Every movement, every word, every social bond had its place determined by hierarchy, gender, and obedience. At the top of that structure stood the Tokugawa shogunate, a military regime that prized stability above all. After centuries of civil war, Japan had entered a period of enforced peace, isolation, and internal order. The samurai, once warriors, had become bureaucrats. The commoners, once restless, were instructed to remain still. Religion was filtered through the state. Foreign contact was cut to near silence. Art flourished, but it had to be controllable. It was within this climate that Kabuki was born. Not from the elite, but from the margins. The word Kabuki itself meant tilted or off-center. Its earliest performances came from a woman named Okuni, a shrine dancer who began staging theatrical performances in Kyoto in the early 1600 seconds. Her style was eccentric, flamboyant, and often suggestive. It drew massive crowds, crossing class and gender boundaries in ways the government found deeply threatening, so they responded the only way authoritarian systems know how. First, they banned women from performing. In 1629, female kabuki was outlawed, officially on the grounds that it was corrupting public morals. But the real reason was control. Women on stage blurred the boundary between art and sexual availability, drawing male patrons not just for theatre, but for pleasure. The state feared not their beauty, but the independence they wielded. Yet the ban did not end the practice. It transformed it. Boys replaced women. Specifically, adolescent boys trained to play the roles of courtesans, noble ladies, and grieving mothers. They were graceful, delicate, and idealized. But more importantly, they were young. Young enough to mimic femininity without threatening male authority, young enough to be shaped. And so began the rise of the onagata male actors, specializing in female roles. Their training was intense. They were taught to move slowly, to walk in tiny steps that made their bodies appear fragile. Their voices were softened, their gestures stylized. They learned how to lower their gaze, how to fold their sleeves just so, how to carry a fan with elegance that was meant to imply submission. It was not just acting, it was embodiment. The onagata became objects of fascination, admiration, and desire, especially among the samurai class. You see, the samurai were in a crisis of identity. In peacetime, their swords were more ornamental than functional. Their honor code remained, but their purpose had shifted. They wore layers of armor in a world where no one was attacking. Their aggression needed redirection, and Kabuki gave it to them. By the 1650 seconds, Kabuki was institutionalized. Professional troops, patronage systems, and theater districts developed in every major city. But with professionalism came commodification. The same boys praised for their artistic skill were also offered for companionship, either implied or explicit, to patrons who paid well enough. The government knew. It was not hidden. In fact, the government regulated it. Teahouses that hosted kabuki performers were often located within licensed pleasure districts, like Yoshiwara in Edo or Shinmachi in Osaka. These were not underground spaces. They were mapped, taxed, inspected. Every brothel and theatre had a registration system. Every performer had a patron. Everything was accounted for. On the surface, these arrangements were called mentorships. Samurai would adopt a young actor, offering financial support in exchange for private companionship. The language was noble. The reality was not. Contracts were drawn, money exchanged, schedules arranged. Sometimes these relationships lasted years, sometimes only nights. The boys were never asked. They were trained. That was considered enough, and if they resisted, there were always others. The system did not require violence. It relied on expectation, on survival, on the idea that to be chosen was better than to be discarded, that to serve was safer than to vanish. Kabuki schools reinforced this. Young actors were often apprenticed by older performers, themselves survivors of the same cycle. They passed down not just stagecraft, but etiquette, how to please, how to avoid punishment, how to endure attention. Some boys gained prestige. A select few even became celebrities, praised in woodblock prints and poetry. But fame did not equal freedom. It simply meant their value had increased. A famous boy drew richer patrons, and richer patrons expected more. It is important to understand that this was not considered criminal. It was not even considered abnormal. Edo Japan had no single legal framework for age, consent, or sexual propriety as we understand it today. What mattered was class, discretion, and hierarchy. A samurai who abused a boy did not lose honor unless he failed to pay for it. The Kabuki world was a paradox celebrated for its beauty, structured by abuse. It created icons while breaking children. It was art, commerce, ritual, and power, fused into a single machine. And no one stopped it, because it was elegant, because it was profitable, because it served a purpose. The curtain would rise, the boy would become a princess, the crowd would cheer, then the curtain would fall, and another performance would begin. They awoke before dawn. Always. The wooden dormitories behind the theater walls were quiet then, still bathed in the grey breath of night. The boys rose silently, one by one, folding their sleeping mats, tightening the fabric of their robes, rinsing their faces in cold water from shallow wooden basins. No voices, no greetings, just the quiet ritual of endurance. Some were as young as 12, others nearing 16. The youngest rarely lasted long. Illness, despair, disobedience. They disappeared without announcement. Their names were not spoken, only their sandals, left behind near the doors, hinted that someone had once slept there. These were the Wakashu boys chosen for their beauty, their lightness, their still-forming features. Their daily life blurred performance and obedience. Training began with physical drills, walking in soft, floating steps, bowing with grace, holding silence with discipline. Their masters corrected every flick of the wrist, every misplaced eye movement. They were not taught to express, but to embody. After movement came voice. Boys spent hours learning how to pitch their tones higher, gentler, more melodic. Pain was hidden, laughter subdued, crying forbidden. Their speech became a kind of poetry, soft and clipped, meant to sound elegant but distant, like a breeze that barely touched the earth. They did not play. They rehearsed. They did not dream. They memorized. Meals were plain rice, pickled vegetables, miso soup eaten quickly and without discussion. Laughter was discouraged. Questions were unwelcome. The older boys supervised the younger ones with a quiet severity passed down from the generation before. No one needed to explain the rules. They were understood. The boy in the thumbnail could have been any of them. His robe hangs loosely not by carelessness, but by instruction. A slightly opened collar revealed more than skin, it revealed compliance. Vulnerability, the qualities their patrons sought, and the patrons came often. The teahouses operated like extensions of the theatre. Between performances or late at night, the boys were summoned. Sometimes to serve tea, sometimes to sing, sometimes to pour sake slowly while kneeling on tatami mats, careful not to let sleeves drag. It always began politely. It never ended that way. They were touched on the wrist, the neck, the small of the back, complimented in rehearsed tones. The samurai often smiled, offered gifts, whispered promises. Some boys believed them, at least at first. When it was over, they returned to their quarters. Silently, they changed out of their stage robes, cleaned themselves in cold water, and went to bed beneath thin blankets. If they cried, they did so into their sleeves. Quietly, so as not to disturb the others, because no one came to comfort them, not even the other boys. Each one had already learned compassion was dangerous. It made you visible, and in a place where selection was both a reward and a sentence, visibility was something to be feared. They learned how to move without drawing notice, how to perform exhaustion without collapsing, how to smile just enough on stage to keep the patrons watching but never enough to invite more than they could bear. They had no parents, only masters, no brothers, only competitors. Occasionally, a patron would choose a favorite. These arrangements were longer term, often more luxurious. The chosen boy might receive better meals, softer robes, fewer duties. From the outside, it looked like elevation, but inside, it was another kind of confinement. These boys were moved to private rooms. They disappeared from group rehearsals. They traveled with their patrons behind closed palanquins. They were praised but no longer seen. Their world became smaller, more ornate, more silent. Many hoped for that kind of arrangement, until they got it. And when they returned, if they returned, they spoke less. They smiled less. They trained harder. You must understand, this was not chaos. It was order. The life of a Kabuki boy was a perfectly structured performance, one that extended far beyond the stage. Even their bodies were regulated. They were forbidden to grow out of their roles. The transition to adulthood was feared not because it brought freedom, but because it made them less desirable. Once their voices cracked, or shoulders broadened, they were discarded, replaced. Some tried to delay the change. They fasted to stay thin, walked in chilled air to suppress the onset of puberty. Older actors applied makeup to hide age, but the audience always knew. Youth was a currency, and the moment it faded, the boy was no longer valuable. A few transitioned into adult roles. Some became teachers, stage managers, or comic performers, but most vanished, quietly. Their names were not recorded in the official histories. Only their roles, the characters they once played, were remembered. And those characters were always beautiful, always graceful, always obedient, never real. For the boys themselves, there was no legacy, no lineage. Only memory passed in whispers backstage, in the silent glances shared between performances, in the way one boy might adjust another's sleeve before the curtain rose. They endured because they were taught to. They performed because they had no other path. They smiled because the patrons demanded it. And when their time ended, they left nothing behind. No portrait, no journals, only masks. 2 of them, one that smiles, one that weeps. And both, like the boys who wore them, were never meant to speak. The abuse did not happen in shadows. It happened in registers, in contracts, in policy. The suffering of the Kabuki boys was not hidden from the world. It was written into the structure of Edo society itself. And the men who orchestrated it did not wear masks or move in secret. They wore seals of office, family crests, swords they no longer used in war. They called themselves guardians of tradition. The Tokugawa state ruled over one of the most controlled societies in pre-modern history. Every town, every district, every profession was ranked and tracked. Samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants, each class had its place. And the Kabuki theater, for all its flamboyance, was not an exception. It was embedded in the state's economic and ideological machine. Each Kabuki troupe required a license to perform. The theaters were confined to specific districts, such as the Nakamura-za in Edo or the Minami-za in Kyoto. These were not arbitrary locations. They were deliberately placed near registered pleasure quarters districts where brothels, tea houses, and entertainment halls existed under tight legal oversight. In places like Yoshiwara, pleasure and performance were fused into a single industry, one that was taxable, one that could be monitored. The government did not suppress this economy, it regulated it. Every boy who performed on stage had to be registered with a troupe. The troupe itself was managed by a head actor or manager, known as the Zagashira. This figure held extraordinary power. He arranged casting, oversaw training, negotiated patronage, and often facilitated off-stage arrangements between performers and samurai clients. In other words, he was both director and broker. Young actors were not independent. They were bound by a web of obligations to the troupe, to their teacher, to their patrons. Apprenticeship contracts were often written not by the boys or their families, but by the theater managers. These agreements could span years. During that time, the boys' labor, appearance, and body were effectively under the control of the troupe. The boys were seen not as individuals, but as investments. Their beauty was an asset, their obedience was expected, and their silence was built into the system. The economics of Kabuki made this dynamic unavoidable. Theaters needed to turn a profit. Ticket sales were inconsistent, and competition between troupes was fierce. Patrons, especially samurai and wealthy merchants, became essential. They didn't just buy tickets, they funded entire productions. Sponsored costumes, paid for new plays to be written, but they expected something in return. Not just a performance, not just a bow at the end of the play. They wanted proximity, influence, access. A favored patron might insist that a particular boy be given a central role in a performance, might demand time with him after the show, might even arrange for the boy to be escorted to his estate for an evening, for a week, or indefinitely. These arrangements were known. They were normalized. They were sometimes written in euphemistic language: mentorship, guardianship, cultural sponsorship. But everyone understood what they meant. The samurai received companionship. The theater received funding. The boy received attention, and the unspoken expectation to accept it without protest. The Zagashira often negotiated these deals directly. Some even built entire business models around the exchange of actors for elite patronage. The more beautiful the boy, the more refined his manners, the higher the price. He was not sold in alleys or in secret. He was priced in ledgers. Even the government was complicit. While direct prostitution was officially illegal for kabuki actors, enforcement was inconsistent and superficial. Inspectors rarely intervened in elite arrangements, especially those involving high-ranking samurai. The state's priority was not to protect the actors, it was to preserve social order. As long as these relationships remained discreet and followed ritual forms, they were permitted. Sometimes, kabuki boys were even paraded in public during festival seasons, dressed in full makeup and elaborate robes. Patrons would bid for their company not in whispers, but in auctions. The winning samurai would be celebrated, not condemned. Some districts began to develop actor catalogues, woodblock printed booklets featuring portraits and short biographies of popular kabuki boys. These catalogues resembled both playbills and advertisements. They praised the actor's performance, yes, but also his charm, his voice, his elegance. There were rankings, fan clubs, merchandising, and beneath it all, quiet access. In a society obsessed with appearances, kabuki became a mirror, a dazzling one that reflected power, control, and beauty. But the image was curated, controlled, and the reality behind it was carefully kept behind screens. Even among the samurai, kabuki companionship became a form of status. To be seen with a famous onagata was not shameful, it was fashionable. It signified taste, culture, sophistication. And because the boys were male, these arrangements avoided the scandal attached to courtesans. In a twisted irony, same-sex exploitation became socially cleaner, more refined, and so a new tier of power emerged, one not based in war or conquest, but in aesthetic dominance. The samurai no longer drew swords, they drew veils. They chose performers like collectors chose lacquerware for form, not for humanity. And the boys learned to move like objects, graceful, still, silent. It was not a matter of personal cruelty. Many patrons claimed to love the boys. Some believed it, others were simply fulfilling tradition. But tradition, unchallenged, becomes a machine. And the machine of Edo Kabuki ran smoothly through contracts, costumes, and candlelight, and through the boys who were trained not just to perform on stage but to disappear off of it. The first time is quiet. The boy is young, barely into his teens. He is called, not asked. A senior actor adjusts the collar of his robe before he walks into the tea house. No words, only a soft touch to straighten the fabric, a glance that lingers just a second too long. The door slides open, and he kneels. What happens that night is not recorded in any playbill, but it echoes. Not through screams, those are rare. Not through rebellion that would be useless. It echoes through imitation, because what happens to one boy does not stop with him. It becomes a lesson. The kabuki system was a theater in more ways than one. Its performances were not confined to the stage, nor were its roles restricted to the play. Every boy entered as an apprentice, and every apprentice learned the unspoken choreography of submission from the generation before him. And so the cycle continued. Older boys, once victims themselves, became the enforcers. Not with cruelty, not always, but with instruction. They taught the younger ones how to behave in front of patrons, how to keep the eyes lowered just enough to appear humble, how to sit without shifting, how to undress without fumbling, how to return to rehearsal without emotion. This was called training. It was passed down like sword forms or tea ceremonies, ritualized, repeatable, stripped of feeling. The theater masters encouraged it. It created discipline, efficiency, predictability, and the boys, they complied, because those who learned fastest were favored, promoted, protected for a time. They performed not only for the audience, but for survival. To fail was to be replaced. To resist was to vanish. In time, even their memories folded inward. They forgot the boundary between stage and chamber, between the character and the boy. They began to believe that beauty was meant to be used. That stillness was virtue. That attention was safety. And when they aged out, when their features sharpened, or their voices dropped, or their steps grew too firm, they stepped behind the curtain and became the next instructors. The cycle was not driven by sadism. It was driven by structure, because there was always a new boy, always another debut performance. The Onagata roles, female characters performed by male actors, were the backbone of Kabuki's popularity. And because women were banned from the stage, replacements were always needed. Fresh faces, youthful limbs, soft voices. The demand was endless. Troupes competed to debut the most exquisite boys. Posters were printed, names were whispered, patrons lined up. A successful debut could bring wealth and prestige to the theatre, but it also brought danger to the boy, because success meant visibility, and visibility meant ownership. A famous boy became a prize. He could not walk through the theatre district without being followed. Wealthy patrons sent gifts. Some offered mentorships, contracts that disguised possession as education. The boy would be removed from group rehearsals and placed in private lessons, or in private rooms. What was called favor was often isolation. And when the novelty faded, as it always did, the boy was returned to the troupe, quieter, thinner, older than his years. The next boy was already being fitted for his first robe. The rotation never stopped. Even outside the theatre, the culture reinforced it. The ideology of wakashudo, or the way of the youth, gave an intellectual cover to these relationships. Rooted in earlier samurai traditions, it described bonds between older warriors and adolescent boys as noble, even spiritual. Loyalty, admiration, mentorship, all were wrapped in poetic language. But in practice, wakashudo had long since lost its idealism. What remained was a vocabulary to excuse possession, a justification for hierarchy. In the Kabuki world, it became especially dangerous, because the boys were already trained to obey. They bowed easily, they smiled on command, they moved like porcelain dolls, beautiful and brittle. And the patrons believed their own lies. That these boys chose their roles, that this was art. That silence meant agreement. Even those who saw through it, those who felt the weight of what was happening, rarely spoke. Because what alternative was there? To reject the patron was to lose protection. To challenge the system was to lose everything. And so the system remained self-sustaining. Every generation of boys was shaped by the one before it. Each learned not just how to perform, but how to endure. And in doing so, they taught the next. No laws were passed to stop it. No courts intervened. Because in Edo, Japan, hierarchy was law. Samurai were above question. Actors were beneath it. Theatres that produced obedient boys thrived. Those that resisted, or whose actors became too independent, lost funding, lost favor, closed their doors, and so the curtain rose, again and again. The same scenes, the same steps, different boys, same story. Even the art itself began to mirror the abuse. Plays were written where young characters sacrificed themselves for duty, where silence was equated with virtue, where beauty was punished and obedience rewarded. The audience applauded, not realizing they were watching real lives echoing back at them. Or perhaps they did realize, and applauded anyway, because the performance was exquisite, because the boys were beautiful, because suffering, when stylized, becomes spectacle, and no one interrupts a spectacle. Not in Edo, Japan, not in the Kabuki theater, not when the system is working exactly as designed. When the lights dimmed on the final act, and the curtain was drawn across the Kabuki stage, what remained was not applause, it was silence. Silence that echoed across generations, not because the story ended, but because no one was allowed to tell it. The boys who performed these roles, who knelt on tatami floors, who wore the painted faces, who learned the art of graceful surrender, they did not write memoirs. Their voices were never recorded. They left behind no manifestos, no accusations, no vindications. They disappeared from history as easily as they had entered it. Stage left, then gone. What remains are the records of their performances. Their names, or rather, their stage names printed in fan catalogues. Their faces etched into woodblock prints, smiling in costume, eyes frozen in stylized joy. To the casual historian, they are beautiful images from a refined art form. But those who know how to look, who know the gestures, the rituals, the codes, can see what lies beneath. What they left behind was not biography, but ritual. A repeating pattern. A system so efficient that even after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868, the structure persisted. Boys continued to be trained, continued to perform, continued to be claimed. Modernization came slowly. The Meiji Restoration introduced Western values, and with them, a new kind of scrutiny. Women were eventually allowed to return to the stage not for moral reasons, but for nationalist ones. Japan needed to show itself as a modern empire, capable of matching Europe, and that meant aligning its public image with Western sensibilities. But the old practices did not vanish. They merely changed form. The boy actors of the Edo period became a kind of myth, revered for their artistic purity, romanticized as symbols of a lost age, their exploitation rewritten as devotion, their suffering reframed as sacrifice for the sake of beauty. In this way, the abuse was not erased, it was aestheticized, and so Kabuki endured. The art form is still alive today, praised for its tradition, its stylization, its disciplined grace. Tourists fill the seats of Kabuki theaters in Tokyo and Kyoto. Scholars write volumes on the elegance of Onagata performance. Cameras flash, programs are sold, but no one asks about the boy. Not the real one. The one behind the mask. The one kneeling in the thumbnail you saw. The image you looked at was not staged. It was an echo, a composite of thousands of moments passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, robe to robe. The stillness in the boy's body was learned. The fear in his eyes was familiar. And the man behind him, the one crouching close, hand on his neck, was not an aberration. He was the system. The legacy of that system stretches beyond Kabuki. It lives in how we remember the past, in who we allow to speak, and who we assign to silence. In how easily we accept the beauty of tradition without questioning what was sacrificed to maintain it. It lives in every history that praises elegance while omitting pain. In every institution that rewards obedience but punishes truth. In every image that makes suffering look graceful. And though the samurai are long gone, and the tea houses have been rebuilt into museums, the structures that enabled this cycle hierarchy, control, ritualized silence remain in other forms. They always do. History has a way of preserving power while discarding pain. But not always. Today, more scholars are beginning to recover these hidden voices, to study the contracts, the letters, the marginalia left in theatre archives, to reinterpret the plays not just as art, but as windows into lived experience. The boy is beginning to be seen not as a role, but as a person, not just as a victim, but as a witness. And yet, the full story may never be known. Too many names were erased, too many documents lost, too many boys taught to forget themselves. So we are left with fragments, a half-torn robe, a stylized bow, a mask that will not speak. But perhaps those fragments are enough if we learn how to see them. If we learn how to read beauty not just for its perfection, but for what it cost. Because behind every exquisite performance, someone paid. Behind every curtain drawn in elegance, someone knelt in silence. And behind every tradition preserved, someone was never allowed to leave.